Hello and good afternoon. I am not Stuart Rutherford. Instead, I am Sophie Hooper, the Head of Policy and Research here at IWFM, sitting in a rather windy South Cambridgeshire. Myself and our esteemed panel are here today to reflect on the importance of communication and collaboration in decarbonising your building. Net zero is rightly described as the biggest challenge anyone currently working in the built environment has ever faced. By 2030, emissions need to be reduced by 50%, and by 2050, net zero needs to be achieved. And yet it remains a destination without a clear roadmap. The challenge is magnified by uncertainty over which technologies to adopt, the potentially high transformation costs of adopting them, and lack of clarity in government policy now and potentially in the future, which very much clouds investment decision making. What is very clear is that moving towards net zero will require new ways of thinking and behaving from the FM sector and action on several fronts. And later this year, we'll be releasing research from our latest sustainability survey, which will identify key areas of priority for FMs and important suggestions around how the investment process needs to be revamped to help organisations make the needed investment. And we're very likely to touch on that investment process a little bit today. But one important and relatively straightforward way in which FMs can make progress in this area is through more communication and collaboration, both with other FMs and other stakeholders and suppliers to the workplaces that you look after. Tackling net zero will require us all to work together and to share experiences, talk about common problems and work out solutions together sector-wide. This is an area that we explored recently at our roundtable sponsored by Mitsubishi Electric, where the combination of FM practitioners and a key manufacturer proved to be very valuable, demonstrating the merits of joined-up thinking in addressing this multifaceted challenge. It felt like an overdue meeting of minds. We recently published a summary of that discussion in a report entitled The Role of FM and Building Services in Achieving Net Zero and Energy Efficiency. And if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you to take a look at that, please. In this webinar, again in collaboration with Mitsubishi Electric, we have a couple of people who were in that original roundtable discussion, Chris Newman from Mitsubishi Electric and Stuart Wright from Aviva. Welcome again. And they are joined by a member of our sustainability SIG, Reid Cunningham, who kindly peer reviewed the write-up before it was published. And as always, our sustainability SIG members provided really useful additions. I'll ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and talk a little bit about where they are in the road to net zero before we go into the discussion. We would be very keen as well to open it up for question and answer session with the audience, you. So please post any questions that you have around your own roadmap to net zero in the Q&A box from now on. Please don't use the chat function. We can't properly monitor it there, but please use the Q&A box. And the platform also enables you to ask your question anonymously. Just ask your questions as they pop in and we'll try and slot them into the narrative. First up then, please, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and Reid, if we could please start with you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Hi, everyone. My name is Reid Cunningham. I work for BAM in the FM division of BAM, where I am responsible for a department called BAM Energy. We have a number of energy specialists helping deliver carbon neutral and net zero projects for our FM customers. I also maintain a relationship with BAM Nuttall and BAM Construction, where we are supporting all sorts of high efficiency projects and new build projects. My particular interest, of course, is always in the existing environment and built environment where the greatest challenge lies. And I keep telling people that 95% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 are already built. So we're not going to build ourselves out of the problem, but we need to be able to decarbonize that existing built environment. And there's an enormous challenge there, which is also a very exciting challenge. in addition to work on kind of energy efficiency, renewables, I am also involved in some circular economy work where we're trying to make use or reuse as much building fabric and MEP plant as possible in both kind of life cycle activity, plant replacement, but also maintenance, routine maintenance activities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Reid. Chris, please.
Yeah, afternoon, Sophie. Thanks very much indeed for inviting us on today. As it says there, yeah, my name's Chris Newman. I've got the job of Zero Carbon Design Manager for Mitsubishi Electric. So it's kind of my job really to keep up to date with this rapidly changing world of net zero and decarbonisation and changes in industry guidance and legislation that's happening at the moment, and then try and keep my colleagues and our customers up to speed with all of that. And then obviously try and apply our products to try and solve some of those problems and meet some of those requirements. You know, that usually is formed around sort of early stage concept design conversations where we're trying to come up with energy strategies for buildings or projects or feasibility studies for decarbonisation of existing buildings, and just trying to find out what's possible and how can we somehow make it look like the way the client wants it to look like at the end. And obviously somewhere along that, try and get some decarbonisation and get everybody a little bit closer to net zero.
Thank you very much. Stuart?
Yeah, and thank you also for inviting me to join the panel. So I'm Stuart Wright from Aviva, UK's biggest insurer. I've been with Aviva over 20 years, most of that time spent as Group Property Director, where I was responsible for managing our worldwide portfolio, including major projects and FM. So I have a bit of background in how all this works. In 2021, Aviva set some ambitious targets around ESG to be a net zero company by 2040. But within that, for its own operations and supply chain to be net zero by 2030. And it's my responsibility to deliver that across the obviously scope 1 and 2 for our own operations, and scope 3 purchase goods and services and business travel for our operational supply, and also for our claim supply. So fingers in lots of pies.
Brilliant. So we may as well go straight to the heart of the topic, really. And this is a question to all. But Stuart, I'm going to invite you to come in first, because everyone, well, net zero is due to be reached by 2050. You've just said 2030. That's heaping on a little bit of an extra challenge for yourself. How are you going to get there? And more importantly, how can collaboration with key stakeholders help you get there?
Well, I mean, we could spend the whole webinar talking about how we're going to get there. But what I will say is that I think I really do subscribe to the fact that every little bit does help. And doing a little bit every day. If you look at the size of the problem, and it'd be very easy just to say it's impossible. So you just basically just starting and decarbonisation studies, understanding your baseline, you know, how much power are you consuming, where are you consuming it, how much gas are you using, what are the big users. So understanding your baseline, setting your target, and then looking at the pathway between where you are and where you need to be, and then just setting off to address first small things and then bigger things, and eventually you will get to decarbonisation. And it's not easy, and there are setbacks. So you stay confident and stay strong, because it's hard. But I think in terms of communication, what I will say is that, I mean, I've worked in FM for a number of years, and generally that tends to be lots of people complaining about what you're doing and lots of responding to incidents as they occur. In the net zero space, I found that actually people want to be engaged. And our colleagues, nothing has engaged our workforce like the net zero agenda. And I get probably one idea a week from our colleagues as to what we might do. Some of them are bonkers, but actually some of them are, I wish I had thought of that. So there's an awful lot of work we do, just working with our teams internally to say, what should we be doing? Are you prepared to accept your building temperature a little bit higher in the summer or a bit lower in the winter? Can we sort of, I don't know, close this set of toilets, or let's if we've got few people in the office, can we only work in a small space? Can we close our buildings on a Saturday or Sunday? Do you really have to come in 3 people on a Saturday to an office? Can you not do that role from home? So working with our teams to make sure their behaviours sort of align to what we're trying to achieve, but then across a whole load of stakeholders, investors, landlords, occupiers, FMs. Just as an example, some of our buildings I know will need additional plant, and actually some of that plant is a lot bigger or a lot more invasive to the building than perhaps some of the existing plant. And so our FMs are saying, well, there's nowhere to put this stuff. Well, I'm saying, well, let's use some meeting space. Let's take a bit of an upper floor and move it from being office space to plant space, which I don't think many FMs would come to me and suggest because they didn't think we would accept it. But the other challenge, of course, when you go to landlords are worried about their net internal area, and they're saying, well, why would we reduce our net internal area by giving up some place for plant? But working with FMs, people like Chris and landlords say, actually, if you are going to have a building which has a future, which is viable in a net zero environment, you are going to have to make some sacrifices. You're going to have to make some changes. Unless we work together to optimize those changes for the suppliers of the kit, the users of the buildings, the managers of the buildings, then we're not going to get there. So I think with a 2030 target, we're probably facing some of these problems a little bit sooner than others, but I think eventually everyone will get there and we need to work together.
Thank you, Stuart. You touched on quite a few areas that I think we'd like to explore a little bit further down the road. Can I ask Chris and Reid as well for their thoughts on the collaboration piece, and how can collaboration with key stakeholders help you improve your building's energy performance?
Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier on, we try and get involved as early as possible in project conceptions, because as Stuart quite rightly put there, one of the big challenges, especially with a product that we use a lot, being heat pump technology, is it is typically physically larger than, say, a gas boiler. It might have to be located externally. There's maybe different electrical infrastructure. There could be noise concerns. There's all sorts of other things that need to be considered. And it can be really difficult to solve some of those problems when you're already 75, 80% of the way down a particular route. So getting involved a little bit earlier, collaborating, actually finding out why the client wants to make these changes, what the outcome actually is supposed to look like, and find out where the red lines are, really, because I think Stuart touched on it there. We've had lots of examples where the contractor or the FM has sort of said, "Man, we're not even going to propose that. That's not feasible. It's not viable." The client has said no to that before on other projects, but actually, when you find out that client has got a really looming net zero target, or they've got a risk of that building becoming a stranded asset because it's not going to meet its minimum EPC rating or something like that, things that they've said no to before, actually they're much more willing to entertain, depending on what the drivers are. So I think early engagement is really important. And as again, as Stuart said, a collaborative approach. If we agree what the problem is, and we agree what the solution needs to look like, then we can find a way to get there, rather than working in individual silos where the client knows what he wants and the contractor knows what they want. We're a manufacturer, we make boxes that do what they do, and the three things aren't meeting up together, they're not joining up together. So yeah, I think that sharing, actually being honest, is probably the most important thing. So that you actually know realistically what's possible, what's not possible, what's viable, what's not viable, so that you're not wasting anybody's time.
Thank you for sharing. Reid.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. I agree very much with Chris and Stuart, and I think Stuart's point at the start, talking about how there's lots of little things will make a big difference, and then you're left with maybe some of the bigger, more difficult things to deal with as well. And I think what we see, which also reflects maybe some of what Stuart was saying about kind of feedback and collaboration, but having good data as well is just invaluable. It's impossible, whatever walk of life you're in, to make good decisions without actually having some good data, to either look at where your problems really lie, and to make positive, impactful decision making, knocking out the easy things first, for example, but then also measuring your success. the success that follows some of the implementation of small or large things as well. So we do tend to see that the data which many customers or building occupants have for energy isn't all that good often. And there is a lot of data out there to get. Half-hour data from meters over a certain size is pretty standard. You're actually, most people with an electrical supply are paying for half-hour data to be collected, but they're not always the recipient themselves of that data, and you can ask for it and receive it. And you can, there's lots of tools out there in the market which can help you analyze it, without having a degree in an energy related subject. And you can add other meters to gas and water and other services if you want, or sub-meters to get really good data. And from that, I think there's, even before we start this collaboration piece with manufacturers, we can probably be making between 5 and 15% energy improvement in just operating buildings better, because we tend not to, or there tends to be a little bit of a kind of performance gap between how a building can really work and how we're able to operate them or are operating them, through BMSs and various set points and things. And I think it comes back to Stuart's point about working with the users and the occupants as well. There's enormous potential to make kind of improved occupancy type decisions to make buildings perform better. And that's the easy stuff, and it's low cost stuff. But eventually on a building's life cycle, there'll be opportunities to start thinking about the gas boilers that are already 25 or 30 years old. And this is the wrong moment to say, let's replace the gas boilers with some high efficiency gas boilers. The opportunity now is to change and to make a sort of a roadmap of decisions which will lead to that net zero or carbon neutral target. And for that, I think the engagement, the collaboration with the manufacturers is invaluable.
It's interesting, sorry, Reid, you said that actually, because we're working collaboratively with UK Green Building Council, and they've been doing some preliminary work on the potential savings for optimizing buildings. And it could even be bigger. It could be 20-25% savings on energy and carbon just for optimizing it. And you're absolutely right, because you can't reduce what you don't measure. So you've got to get the starting point, haven't you?
Absolutely. We're doing quite a bit of work in this area, and I think we could probably talk about data and actually the need for information gathering and etc. all day. You're absolutely right though, Chris. The efficiencies that can be gained are humongous, absolutely astounding, and that is just by doing good, proper FM, actually. Just good, proper operationalizing and maintenance, etc. Now, I was distracted by a question from Christopher, because my next question was going to be around what are we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers actually to getting good collaboration in place, that you're not always getting early engagement, the lack of data to really optimize, developing a solution really that fits it. There is that external component as well around the wider environment and the regulatory drivers, which used to be a big part of the drivers in the area of sustainability. And we'll touch on this much further later as well. But Christopher Woods asked around what the thoughts are around the PM's decision to delay some of his net zero targets. And while I appreciate we might not necessarily go down a political route, I think we can kind of turn this into an investment question around organizations needing to make investments, especially against the background of an energy policy crisis, inflation going up, and this uncertainty at international level around how hard some of these targets are going to be pushed. So what are you seeing more generally around this and the impact of a decision like this to delay some of the net zero targets is it really impacting organisations' drive towards net zero?
I'm happy to say a couple of things about that. I think that currently net zero is a choice. Aviva have chosen to have a target of 2030 for our operations and 2040 as a business. The 2050 target is effectively enshrined in law. So it won't, I don't think, change our approach. I think it makes it slightly harder. I think the 2030 target, for instance, for electric vehicles has probably driven quite a lot of change within the motor manufacturing industries, and they've accelerated production and design and all sorts of other things. And if that drive is relaxed, I suppose that there might be perhaps a relaxation of their emphasis on that. And if that then extends into, I don't know, heat pumps and a whole load of other things, hydrogen, etc., then I think that's the challenge. I think that, if you're not working almost like on a war footing where everyone is working with a sense of urgency, I think that can be a challenge. But I think the world isn't getting any cooler, irrespective of what a government might do. And Aviva, certainly our approach is very much, we're doing this not for commercial reasons, although it has to stack up on an individual commercial basis when we're doing projects, but fundamentally we're doing this because we think it's the right thing to do. And I think it remains the right thing to do, irrespective of governments changing. But I do think there will be more internal questions asked, to be being honest about, what are the drivers. I think lack of regulation and certainly lack of required process around things like scope 3 data, etc., I think are a hindrance. But what it means is we're filling the gap, and we're doing a lot of work to try and create those processes, working with some of our bigger suppliers which are influential, so that we will move this forward, I think, irrespective of perhaps relaxing targets.
Yes, certainty is really key. Chris Skidmore led the independent review on net zero, and one of the big findings of that report was the lack of certainty, because one of the biggest crises that we might be facing is that when we finally do get that certainty come down the line, and we do get that stronger legislation and guidance that everyone's looking for, there won't be enough time. We won't have built the necessary skills. The supply chains won't be in place, and then it'll become really difficult to deliver. And obviously, we don't want to be in a situation where we're all trying to scrabble around desperately in 2035, 2040 to solve what is a huge problem by then. And the carbon budgets that the government have signed up to as part of the nationally determined contributions in the Paris Climate Agreement should at least give us a little bit of how to put it, like a little bit of a guide, so that we're reducing emissions in a fairly steady way, rather than it trying to be a cliff edge in 2049. But that lack of certainty is a problem, because, as you said, Stuart, a lot of clients are choosing to do it themselves, and it's really difficult when you're making a choice that might not in the short term make economic sense for the business. You may be spending money that you don't have to spend, or accepting a change in operational cost that you don't have to accept right now, but you know that you will at some point. So yeah, I think a little bit the comments that are being made, as long as the final goals aren't changing and there isn't too much undermining of those long-term goals, it doesn't worry me too much yet, because at the moment, to be honest, we're still waiting for a lot of the legislation. We're waiting for a lot of consultations to actually come to a close anyway. So it's not as if we have the firm legislation that's been removed. We don't actually have it yet. So I'm going to kind of keep my powder dry on that one and see what happens over after the election, maybe.
Yeah, I haven't heard any particular announcements since the general headlines this morning, but I think probably, I imagine the policy changes might be affecting maybe consumers rather than industries and businesses. We'll wait and see, but I think there's, like both Chris and Stuart have kind of said, I think there's a head of steam and a momentum already generated in business and commerce, and institutional investors are now expecting to see the companies they invest in have a carbon reduction plan. And whether a government adds 5 years or not to when they're going to change the regulations for petrol and diesel cars, I think the car industry is a global industry, and Richie Sunak's decisions won't actually make a blind bit of difference to that industry that's now off and running, except how many cars they might sell in the UK, which is probably to most of them not that relevant. I think these are probably my personal views, but I think for institutional investors, there's such momentum already built up that people will kind of stick to their plans as businesses, you know.
Thank you for that.
I think just one thing, which probably is might impact in Chris area is I know there is a real skills challenge. There's a real skills challenge in terms of training for people who are maintaining and repairing and installing things like heat pumps, and that skill challenge I know exists if we were to have 2030 as a target or 25 as a target for gas boilers. My fear is that if those targets slip by 5 years, then the impetus falls away and we wait for another 5 years, then we have another skills challenge. If we can maintain momentum and just have longer to do that training and longer to do that education, that would be a better approach to it. So I think this might be interesting to see how this is implemented if there is a change rather than the change itself. So because actually I think some of the things we are trying to do we didn't have time to do by the targets. If we can maintain the momentum but change the dates, then it may be that we do have time to do what we need to do.
Yeah,
No, thank you for that.
Sorry, Sophie. I was going to say it can't all be about the stick. You do need a bit of carrot as well, don't you, to get everybody moving in the right direction. Yeah.
Yes, although the FM sector as a whole would at times be seen to be compliance driven, but I think what you have demonstrated is very much a shift in the drivers on the sustainability agenda, that actually it's the right thing to do, and if you want to future proof your buildings, you need to be acting now. And as you said quite rightly, Chris, if you want to achieve targets down the road, you need to start thinking about that and laying out your investment decisions. And I'm pleased to say that kind of confirms last year's results from our sustainability survey on net zero and carbon, that actually that social imperative is getting much greater than possibly the political one. But one thing that you touched on is that uncertainty piece around investment. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about investment, because investing in net zero is not necessarily all about getting efficiency gains. Some investment will need to be made. Sometimes it will cost as well. How do you manage to make the business case for that? And Stuart, I know that you've been quite enthusiastic about driving that.
I mean, I'm very fortunate. I mean, certainly within Aviva, I have the backing of our CEO, Amanda Blanc. So I know that, I can tread softly but carry a big stick to a certain extent, because actually we are very much wanting to deliver our net zero agenda. And certainly when I put together my net zero business case, using the templates that inevitably we will have in a financial services organisation, I didn't say there was going to be a return on the investment for the investment that we were making. And that was accepted because this program it has a certain amount of uncertainty to it. But I mean, fundamentally, if you reduce carbon emissions, you are reducing your costs. So in the longer term, your run costs will reduce. So that there are ultimately financial savings. But I think if you go into this with a purely financial view, then you're probably not going into it in the right frame of mind. A little bit like real living wage. You can't look at the cost business case for that. There's a lot more cost, not cost related, value related reasons why you might do this. But I think there's almost like kind of have to be a change. You have to work very closely with your business as usual, your people who are running your environment, because boilers do need changing. And if you see moving from a gas boiler to an air source heat pump as just the cost of an air source heat pump, then of course it's not going to look a particularly great business case. But if you see it as at some point the gas boiler has to be replaced, that would have a cost. At some point pumps have to be replaced, controls might have to be updated, BMSs have to be software updated, or whatever it might be. If you can integrate your life cycle replacement program with your pre-planned maintenance program with your net zero program and put all that together, and then also look at the cost, the budgets that are available. You've got a business unit budget for failures. You've got as you say, pre-planned LCR budgets, and you've got my net zero. If you put all that together, then actually it is not just one big financial hit. And in the longer term, you get run rate or run rate savings. I'm not saying it's going to be a fantastic business case, but it is not just about spending. It is not just about the cost, but approach it with all your budget holders, with all your experts. Look at the whole system, and I think it starts to stack up.
I've got some really good examples, practical examples of this. I think you touched on it really well there, Stuart. It's different pots of money, because if you purely look at your operational cost of your building, for example, we know that electricity is a lot more expensive than gas, using that example, and therefore it can be quite challenging to match that operational cost. But on the flip side, there will be other budgets for example, carbon offsetting that the business might be doing to try and achieve carbon neutrality. Or I know businesses that actually tax themselves, like an internal carbon tax, to help, build their own decarbonisation fund. Or maybe, it could be about the rent that you charge to a tenant on a building, if you can make that building more attractive because it's a lower carbon building. I think you're absolutely right. If you only look at it in isolation with one particular thing, then it can sometimes be difficult to find return on investment. But as soon as you widen it, and that feeds into this conversation about net zero being a much bigger thing than just reducing carbon, and it's a much longer term and wider lens. And the more things you bring into it, improving local air quality or whatever it happens to be, all of a sudden starts to make a much more viable business case, rather than purely what's my return on investment, will I get it in 5 years?
Right, thank you, Chris. Did you want to add anything to that, Reid?
I don't think I've got an awful lot to add at all. I think Stuart and Chris have summed it up really well. The only other factor I guess that I've got an interest in is the capital cost. Well, the idea of replacing a boiler with a heat pump, as we're seeing for lots of reasons, has other benefits rather than just getting some heat for a certain price. I think part of the collaboration that we're talking about today is also for the facilities management kind of as customers to kind of understand what a heat pump is. It's a boiler is a really simple concept, and it so beautifully simple. We've been using them and become very, very accustomed to the simplicity of them. A heat pump's quite a sophisticated piece of kit. I'm sure Chris will tell us, and it needs commissioned really carefully and well, and it kind of needs loved and nurtured and kind of all this stuff. Now, there's lots of great ways of being able to monitor the performance of the unit seasonally and make sure that they remain super efficient. I mean, they're fantastic pieces of kit, but they're not simple. And I think the skill set and the sort of awareness of how the units work needs to be understood, and we can do that through collaboration and exchanging data and things. I think the other thing that we need to be aware of is you can't just expect a heat pump to push out water at 80 and bring it back at 70 like the old boiler used to do. There might be some downstream adjustments that need made, or considerations that need to be thought about. But I absolutely get what Stuart and Chris are saying, that it's not just a return of investment. Pay for the project out of savings. That isn't how decarbonisation is going to work best.
Thank you, Reid. Now, you touched on some. Sorry, Stuart.
Sorry, I just want to pick on something, Rita, because I think it has never been more important to look at the whole system. it's never been more important to look at everything from the user experience all the way through environmental control to the heat source. And I think we tend to compartmentalize that a little bit. You have complaints for users, you have people who play with the BMS, and you have people who install components, and they don't very often talk to each other. It's never been, I don't think, more important to actually run things at their design, as they were designed to be run, and then encourage the users to accept those conditions or make deliberate changes. We've just done some work on one of our buildings where we decided we wanted to do some BMS controls to get a better view of how things were working. And we found that almost every pump and every control had some little tweak. You know, I'm cold here, or I'm warm there, or it's a bit drafty. FM goes in, makes a little change. The thing was all over the place. There were so many different things that were controlling and changing. The whole system was working against itself. I think it's never been more important to join everyone up in that chain from Chris as his installer all the way through to the end user and say, how do we make the system work at its optimum, rather than to the requirement of individuals in little pockets at some place in the building.
Thanks. I was just wanting to bring Chris in on that point, to be honest, around the commissioning piece, and kind of in combination with what you've said, Stuart, because the equipment commissioning time always seems to get squeezed. And that obviously has got an impact, Stuart, as you described. Chris, how do you usually, as a manufacturer, try and counter that to make sure that your products as designed can deliver?
It's quite a big question, to be honest, Sophie.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that, I mean, first of all, as a manufacturer of kit, as most manufacturers do, we offer service to come and commission our equipment and make sure that it's set off to work in the right way. But as Stuart touched on, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going around checking every single individual pump and valve on the third-party systems. Obviously, we're commissioning the chiller or the heat pump or the air handler or wherever it happens to be. And so it's really important to get everybody there at the same time to make sure it all integrates and is working as the design should be. But yeah, commissioning is often squeezed at the end of a project, and time is usually up against you. And often the building's empty. You're trying to commission a system in a non-operational environment. So it's very difficult to optimize a system, let's say take a cooling system when you're commissioning it in the middle of the winter, or vice versa if you're trying to commission it in the middle of the summer. And I think commissioning shouldn't necessarily be seen as a start and an end. I don't like the term commissioning. I think maybe setting to work might be a better way of putting it, or somebody in marketing will come up with something better than that. But starting a plant running is one thing. Then actually commissioning it and optimizing it for the environment that it's running in is a different thing. And in theory, that's a process that never stops. And the FM should be continually optimizing and making the system operate in the environment that it's in as best as it can. But there's a fine line between, as Stuart says, where you're not considering the system as a whole, and you're making changes for individual buildings or individual rooms or individual occupants that are affecting the overall efficiency. But that, to me, is where data is the key. You've got to make data-backed decisions, and if a system was commissioned or set to work, and a set of data was taken from its operating parameters, and then a proper seasonal commissioning, or actually the witnessing of the system under load, under genuine conditions, another set of data was taken, and then you actually start to refine it from that point. Whereas I think commissioning at the moment is something that's just done because it needs to be handed over. It's not as if the data is seen with the value that it probably should be seen with. Maybe we're a part of that problem, that we need to provide more data, provide more education to the owners and users of our systems, as an example, because the amount of data that we have available in modern air conditioning, heating, cooling, ventilation systems is huge. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of data points measuring all sorts of things in the system, but it's just numbers if you don't know what they are or what they represent. And that's the skill of the FM contractor, to be experienced with the equipment and understand what they mean, and then begin to record that data, optimize it, and use it to improve the system's performance. So yeah, it's a lot to unpick really. But I just think commissioning is not a one-stop, the end, done. It's been commissioned, that's it. It should be a continuous process.
Thank you. I think you've answered all of my follow-up questions as well that I've been asked to ask. No, that's brilliant. In tune.
Well, this is Reed's problem to solve by the sound of it, most of the time.
And you know, I so much 100% agree with you, Chris, and it's the same point Stuart just made as well. We think about commissioning a building, and then we kind of leave it to run forever. I'm exaggerating, but you know what Stuart was saying earlier about how the BMS just gets adjusted and tweaked and adjusted and tweaked, and bit by bit it gets further and further and further and further away from the design intent originally. And your point, Chris, is exactly the same, that maybe in a you know, for a single asset, and even over shorter periods of time, you know, whether it works in the summer, the spring, the autumn, the winter, whether we're getting the free cooling when the unit can completely shut itself down, but we get free cooling from the ventilation systems. We need to, as FM, in-house FM, or as FM contractors, we need to get a hold of all of this stuff. And it's almost like you commission the system every day. You know, that'd be an exaggeration, but we need to be considering resetting and you know, evaluating, resetting, and that way we'll get that high level of building performance that Sophie, you know, also mentioned at the start, and get rid of all this waste when we're, you know, we don't have that level of attention. And I think the key is the data, because actually with a simple bureau services and with the intelligence that, say, Mitsubishi have of how your heat pumps should be working most efficiently at different times of year or in different environments, we can actually make sure we're securing that best performance every day, you know, without a human being having to try and interpret a massive amount of data and what's going on. And you know, the brave new world of this will be that AI will probably muscle its way into bureau services and start telling us what to do very soon.
Okay, thank you. That's a daunting area we have to explore further at another time. It's very interesting, of course, that we're talking about commissioning and data keeps on coming up. It's really back to basics, isn't it? I think that's one key takeaway for me as well for our program of work, that whole data piece gets further.
But you need sub-metering. There's no point in having you know, one big electrical meter measuring the entire electrical input to, you know, to the building. It needs to be sub-metered for each individual piece of kit, and heat metered as to how much heat's being delivered to this particular floor or this part of the building. So but the problem, I think, the more data you've got, the more time it takes to analyze it, and the more skill required to actually make sense of it into something useful. So I think it's probably going back to the skills area that we talked about before. There's probably a real skill shortage in people who can understand how to collate, understand, and then do something with that data. You know, maybe AI might help us there or not, but I think in the meantime, to solve the problem today, this is where schemes like neighbours and things like that, which force individual sub-metering to actually make you see the numbers and start to be able to consider them. The analogy I always draw is, I'm sure everybody sat here has got an electrical meter at home, you know, a smart meter. And the smart meter doesn't save you any money, but it shows you what you are spending, and you are the one that saves the money. But it's only by having that data in your face and having it available and in an easy, understandable way that you can make those decisions. And we've got to start doing that better in bigger and commercial buildings.
I think that is a lovely segue to a question from Nigel about how do you demonstrate to your stakeholders and customers that you are managing your net zero targets. And Stuart, I'd like to come to you as a first at that question, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I think I mean, it is about dashboards. I mean, you know, I have a dashboard for my program, and it's not secret, and you know, we share it with as many people as we can. and it's actually showing, you know, where are we with our Scope 1 emissions? You know, we have a pathway between 2019, which was our baseline, and 2030, which is our target, and we know exactly what our total emissions were in 2020, and 21, and 22. We've got a forecast of 23, 24, 25, etc. We've got gaps where we're going to be over where we should be in the pathway, and then we have a set of initiatives which are designed to close that gap. So we link the data that we understand that we have with the things that we're going to do to change the position, and we do the same with Scope 2 and grid electricity, where we're now totally green. Scope 3, we're currently, our target is a percentage of suppliers by spend with their own science-based targets, 70% by 2025. We're currently at 30%, and that's tracked every month with the procurement department. So we're constantly saying, we know our target suppliers are, you know, supplier X, you know, they've committed, but they haven't yet had their target confirmed. You know, where are we on that journey? So number of EVs, we have a target of 100% EVs by 2025. You know, we plot for our fleet, we have, again, number of vehicles every month on the fleet. We've banned now, you can't get an ICE vehicle for the fleet, you have to order an EV vehicle, which is helping. So there's, you know, we're constantly recording, and it goes back to data. And some of the data is not that complicated. I think Chris is right. I mean, sub-metering does help, but, you know, most people, and I know that some people look at companies like Aviva and say, well, you know, you're a big company and you probably own or are the head leaseholder of most of your buildings. It's much easier. But actually, we have some buildings where we are a minor tenant, and we work with the landlords, and you can still use sub-metering. Make sure your own demise is metered. Get together with the rest of the tenants, put pressure on the landlord to create a change. So I think even if you're a subtenant, you can still do these things, but gather your data, put it into order so that it aligns to the targets that you're setting, and then report on a regular basis, and draw your people into the things that you're trying to do to make the data, to move the data towards the target.
A quick comment on that, actually, Stuart. I thought really interesting science-based target initiative you mentioned, and as a business, you know, Mitsubishi Electric has signed up to science-based targets for our own business's carbon reduction. But there's a consultation at the moment about widening science-based target initiative to cover individual buildings. So that was about a couple of months ago, I think that came out, and I think that will be a really interesting way of approaching it, where you actually set an independently reviewed science-based target for a specific building to get on its trajectory as an individual asset from where it is to where you want it to be, and then are held to account on that trajectory. Because obviously, when it's part of a business's overall, even if it's an independently SBTi verified target, if you've got a badly performing asset building, you could just get rid of that asset and look to something else. Whereas if it's done to an individual asset that you own, then you're committed to making that happen.
That's
and certainly, you know, Aviva as an investor, you know, we have in our real assets, we have substantial investment, billions of pounds invested in real assets property, where we have a target for 2040 for those to be net zero. And you're quite right, Chris. I mean, you could divest of your more carbon intensive assets, but our approach is that doesn't save the world, if you like. That they just become probably more poorly managed by less responsible investors. So we would rather, as a responsible investor, retain those assets and manage them to net zero, which gives us a bigger challenge, but actually ultimately we will help. But I think what you say about individual building net targets, that will help where you've got multiple occupants who are perhaps struggling with a landlord who is not necessarily interested in a low carbon economy.
Thank you for that, Stuart. I'd like to add, for the audience member asking the question around how people are approaching this today, we have got a net zero toolkit that talks around reporting, and it lists some of the initiatives, like the key initiatives, like science-based target initiative, because as Chris already said as well, it's really important to get that external validation of what you're doing, so that you can actually see, or wider investors can see who's performing well, who isn't performing well, but also it's a bit of truth to power and to yourself, you know, how well are you doing and where can you improve? Right, that should deal with that question, please. FM reporting is really taking place almost at two levels. We've got that genuine data performing the performance of the building in itself. But then at organizational level, you also see a lot more requirements coming into play for organizations to report against ESG targets. Stuart, you talk a lot about the investor perspective, etc. Now, bringing it back to the collaboration question, that ESG reporting is a huge driver, of course, for investments. That tends to target large organizations. How do you collaborate with smaller organizations and your supply chain to help them on that road? Who would like to go first?
There's a lot of methods out there. There are lots of different ways to engage with your supply chain and with your partners. But as you say, at the end of the day, it's about being honest and sharing the information that you've got and where you want to get to, and trying to be sort of solutions focused rather than kind of barriers. And usually there is a way to get where you want to get to. It's just how difficult it will be to get there.
Yeah, I think what we see is a kind of cascading, if you like, government, whether that's entirely relevant or not, but institutional investors into customers into the supply chain, and then tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And I guess, BAM's probably in the position of being, say, a tier 1 kind of contractor in the building and the FM sector. And we are busily sort of engaging with our supply chain, trying to educate some of our supply chains. Some of them are very attentive, and they're doing a great job. But others take a little bit longer to come to understand what we're asking on behalf of our customers. And we use some tools like the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which is quite well established in the UK, and they provide a lot of materials and kind of monitoring as well as to who's watching, who's maybe sort of downloaded or used the tools in the supply chain, and we get that feedback, so we know who's engaging well with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and we can encourage that a lot. I think our own procurement then follows that kind of path, that we're able to then bring those engaged tier 2, tier 3 supply chain into contracts with us. I think there's an interesting slight conundrum, or something you might call it, with a parallel ambition to engage with small and medium-sized businesses regionally, where we can really encourage social value and apprenticeships and local training and employment. And sometimes those smaller businesses are the ones that are a little bit harder to engage on the carbon story. But that's our challenge to do that, and to achieve both things.
I do think this is probably the data challenge of our age. For us, requiring scope 3 data, our scope 3 data from the suppliers, they obviously need to know their own scope 2, but they also need to own their scope 3 as well. So that becomes a bit circular, and you have to know everything before you can know anything. So I would encourage estimation. Let's start from somewhere. For small companies, actually, just electric meter reading, gas meter reading, number of miles traveled in company vehicles together actually probably covers your scope 1 and 2, and let's not make it too much more complicated than that. So we're working with some quite small organizations, and we're working with some quite large organizations, but I think we will almost certainly, I think, as we move towards absolute supplier emission collection from 2025, we will have a hybrid. I think we will have some suppliers where we are working with them and we know their absolute emissions, and we'll have some suppliers where we've had to use cost-based averaging based on sort of sector factors, etc. So I think, but getting somewhere, I think, and having a start point is really important, and then iterating from that start point to get to better accuracy. But I think it would be easy looking at the challenge to say, well, it can't be done. And I think my view is let's start from somewhere, and it probably can be done. But larger companies, one of the reasons we're seeking, and if you want to contract with Aviva now for any contract over £1 million total value, you have to sign up science-based targets. No target, no contract. So we're trying to encourage the larger companies to have science-based targets because it gives the data that we need. But for smaller companies, I think it's up to companies like ours to work with them to get them to understand what SBT is all about, what the scopes are, and then help them with the data collection.
Yeah, and just in connection, Stuart, with that, I would just add, Sophie will be aware that IWFM and some members of the SIG, including myself, have been leading an exercise to provide guidance for the FM industry on the calculation of Scope 3. And kind of setting some boundaries or some kind of service by service kind of carbon intensity around Scope 3 emissions. And for the benefit of anyone who's not unfamiliar with Scope 3, what the early indications are that Scope 3 could be between 80 and 90% of an organization's carbon emissions. Scope 1 and 2, which we are quite straightforward to measure, are actually probably the smaller of the emissions. So Scope 3 is probably going to become a higher priority than it certainly is now in the near future.
I think, Reid, you just stole my plug.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's, of course, several reasons why that's important, because not just the percentage or proportion of emissions that it will take up, but also that particular project will give us a voice in terms of how the occupation phase really contributes to carbon emissions. And I think that's what leads to, or links into some of the problems Chris also mentioned around early engagement in the process when designing buildings or when really looking at solutions, because that occupation voice so often gets lost or not listened to, and really reflecting on the huge impact that you can make by managing your operations. It's underplayed at the moment. I'm very much aware of time, and I just wanted to give an opportunity to answer the last question from one of our audience members. And it really links into the communication piece and the variety of stakeholders to engage with. And Chris, I also really would like to leverage your position as a equipment provider in the solution for this, but it relates to tenants, and as tenants, how can we push landlords opting more green technology in their operation when the key approach for most business while leasing a new premises is low rent, not a green building? So how can you collaborate as that triangle of tenant, manufacturer, and landlord to deliver green buildings?
So we're involved in this quite a lot, obviously, with landlords who own buildings. It can be quite difficult when individual tenants have got either little desire or little engagement with regards to other things, but then also you can have the opposite problem when you've got particular tenants that are very engaged and really want to their particular space to be great, but the landlord hasn't got that much desire to work on the whole of the building. And one of the things that we try and do as a manufacturer, being a stupid example, we try to make things modularized. So if the landlord wants to retrofit one floor of a building when there's a tenancy change, that becomes quite easy rather than having to be an entire centralized plant replacement. And things like that can work quite well. Things like we talked about before about energy metering and monitoring, trying to bring those into the systems as part of the package. But mainly, having a plan is the most important thing, and a longer term business relationship works better. If we know that a landlord wants to decarbonize a building over the next 10 years, for example, that will be multiple measures, more than the measures that we offer, glazing, roofing, insulation, BMS upgrades. There might be all sorts of other things that are going on. But if you can get that plan and that roadmap laid out, and then work with the manufacturer to say, right, well, we want you to deliver right the way across this plan, and then it does start to become a little bit easier. But that's about don't know, that kind of goes against most contractual sort of agreements about putting your cards on the table and being kind of open and honest with how much money you've got to spend or how long you're going to spend that money over. So maybe that is the bit of work that we need to change from this kind of adversarial contractor, supplier, manufacturer relationship to that more collaborative relationship, or where you should, in theory, get a better outcome overall.
Absolutely. I think that's another piece of work that we're doing on the procurement side, is to really move to that win-win situation for all through collaborative contracting. Last opportunity for Stuart or Reid to add anything, because otherwise it will be poll time. Oh, right. Well, we've got an exciting...
Do talk to your landlords, would be my view. I mean, we have done a deal with a landlord where we're a minor tenant. We put solar on the roof of his building, and actually we've agreed with that landlord that he will buy that solar off us at the end of our lease. And that was part of the lease negotiation. So, I think landlords are becoming, more collaborative. And the worst that can happen is the answer is no. So do talk to landlords and see if you can sort something out.
Thank you, Stuart. That's an important reminder that we shouldn't assume a no. Right. Hopefully, we have made a compelling case for the importance of communication and collaboration today. But before we close, we have a little poll, and it would be interesting to see where everyone on the call is when it comes to collaboration and communication around carbon reduction. Have you not really tried and failed? Tried and failed might be the other side. Just talking about collaboration, that might not be the best way of putting it. But in any case, tried and seen modest benefits, or tried and seen real benefits. And we cannot vote, but I'm sure we would add to the last bit to provide some optimism. Right, shall we close the poll? Well, that's positive.
It is.
And that's really encouraging to see. So I would say definitely keep on going. And I hope that today has actually given some further inspiration to try some of the things that our panel has tried before with good success, with more than modest benefits. Some of the benefits that have been talked about, that Chris mentioned, were really quite significant. Right, it is really closing time. It's my turn now to say my thanks to both Mitsubishi and the individual panel, Chris, Reid, and Stuart, for your time and fabulous insights today. For the audience, I would like to remind you that a recording will be available if you would like to listen again or you would like to share with colleagues. And for those non-members, do get in touch if you would like to purchase a copy of the roundtable report or discuss membership options. If you found this session useful, then please download the accompanying report entitled The Role of FM and Building Services in Achieving Net Zero and Energy Efficiency. And a link, well, you'll be able to find it on our website. So thank you very much again for joining us, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.